We are live, MythVision podcast. Usually I do these lives and I've just been getting straight into it, and we have a confession to make. But first,
don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
all right, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald is in the house. And you know what? We thought we need to talk. It's time that he admits what he has come to as a conclusion pertaining to the four Gospels in the New Testament. He has confided in me, and it took some hard work, but we finally came to a conclusion that he thinks everything discussed, written in all four Gospels of the New Testament happened as exactly the way that they are described, and they are all historical to a T. And so, this is our confession and apology. Did I get that right?
No, you did not get that.
Oh,
right.
I got that wrong.
Yeah, right.
I'm sorry. He doesn't think that these Gospels are reliable and accurate to a T. It's a guessing game, if anything, on wondering what actually happened. How did I get that mixed up?
Well, because you thought that I appreciated the Gospels, and therefore, when you appreciate something, you think it's telling always the truth. I'm interested in the Gospels. I think they're beautiful, but they're telling different stories.
Right.
And they're not to be homogenized. They're to be understood for their own sake. And the Gospels are in a discussion with each other. And the richness is in the diversity of the witness of the Gospels, not in that they're homogenous.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I do appreciate the Gospels, but I appreciate them for their diversity, not because they're all telling the same story truly.
So if I said because of that, you're probably going to hell, that doesn't scare you?
No, it doesn't scare me.
So I wanted to have my friend Dennis MacDonald, who's here in the flesh. He's actually in the flesh. This isn't a phantom. And I wanted to discuss his upcoming book that he's doing. We wanted to have a hangout with you. If you have questions, shoot them our way, and Dennis will try and chip away at them. We're giving 90 minutes away, and then, wow, our schedule is pretty slammed. And so you have two books coming. One?
I do, and I want to introduce them both, but I want to start with my favorite book is the synopses of the epic tragedy in the Gospels, which came out 2 years ago. It's 570 pages. It's a bargain. It's for $30, available on Amazon. And the reason I want to start with that is the sequel, which is called Must the Synoptics Remain a Problem, is an answer to people, many of whom were a part of the MythVision chats, who were questioning the existence of the Q document. Now, there are two major contributions that I've made in the synopses. And I'm not going to talk about the contributions to understanding the Gospel of John or the Acts of the Apostles so much, but about the synoptic Gospels themselves. One of the contributions is that I integrate my reconstruction of the so-called Q document, along with other Gospels, in parallel columns set up in chronological order so that one can read from the beginning of the synoptic tradition across the page to Luke to get a sense of the development of the gospel tradition. But many people have been skeptical about Q. And in a documentary that Derek and I have put together, The metaphor that I use in the title is, why is Q in intensive care? Because I think the Q document, the people who tried to reconstruct it made two terrible mistakes right at the beginning. And it continues to be a problem for acceptance of the Q hypothesis. And I'll talk about what they are in just a moment. So this book, Must the Synoptics Remain a Problem, is an answer actually to you who listen to MythVision.
We've made a huge, just making sure I'm correct here, MythVision has been such an impact on you and inspiring to you in terms of how you want to engage with the public, right?
Indeed.
Okay.
Absolutely.
That's good to hear.
And because I got feedback about my work, there were so many people who said, well, we don't have a fragment of Q and therefore it didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm primarily a textual critic, and I've reconstructed other documents from antiquity, mostly Christian apocryphal texts. And classicists are reconstructing lost documents all the time. And to say that you don't have a physical manuscript, let's say, of a Platonic letter, doesn't mean that we don't have evidence that there was such a thing and that we can reconstruct it. So there's a simple-minded negativity about Q that is unfortunate. But there are also scholarly reasons for rejecting the traditional Q reconstruction. And these have been highlighted by people like Mark Goodacre and others who hold to the FAR hypothesis. And one of the great complaints of the traditional Q hypothesis and its reconstruction in places like the critical edition of Q is the commitment that Luke does not know Matthew. So places where we find agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark mean that you can do oscillating priority between Matthew and Luke with certain criteria and reconstruct the lost gospel. Related to that is the commitment of the International Q Project that Mark does not know the Q document. So then you go in through the Gospels, combing out everything that you can find that has Markan influence. And so if you get rid of that, then maybe you have a better chance of identifying the Q document. But we know that the evidence is really quite compelling that Mark knows Q. And if so, it's the earliest witness that we have to the Q document. And in my view, it's really the most fascinating. So that if you get rid of Q as a witness to the lost gospel, you're really...
you mean Mark as a witness to the lost
Mark
gospel?
as a witness, yes,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Mark as the witness to the Q document, you're creating another problem. So the reason that the Q document is in intensive care is that you have two ailments that need treatment. One is Luke's alleged Matthean intolerance. That is, that Luke doesn't know Matthew. Luke knows Matthew. And so we have to factor that in. The second is Q's Markan amnesia. That is, the reconstruction of Q tries to get rid of Markan influence, when in fact Mark is an important witness to the Q document. Now, the solution of these is a simple treatment called reversed priority. That is, you have Matthew-Luke overlaps. Luke knows Matthew. But why is it that more often than not, Luke has a more primitive version than he finds in Matthew? So that the wording or the sequencing of a saying is more primitive in Luke than it is in Matthew, even though he knows Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing's true of Matthew and Mark. Matthew is later than Mark, but Matthew often has more primitive sayings than you'd find in Mark. Now, how can that be? if Matthew is redacting Mark? Now, these are very complex questions, and they are best answered in Greek. I think they're best answered in parallel columns and with certain criteria that one uses to tease out what is the most likely primitive version. You have to use social identity theory to determine the cohesiveness of these materials. Do they come out of the same stratum of memory of the early church? What do you do about sequencing? How do you know that Matthew or Luke is more faithful to the order than not? Mm-hmm. And making it even more exciting is that Mark has Homeric imitations.
You incorporate your mimesis into this.
So mimesis is a very important part of this project, because Mark is involved in what I call a mimetic hybridity. He's rewriting the Lost Gospel Mark, but he also is imitating the Homeric epics.
You mean not Lost Gospel Mark, but just the Lost Gospel?
No, I'm sorry. No.
Sorry, I know what you mean now.
Well, let me say it again.
Okay.
Mark is creating a mimetic hybrid. On the one hand, he's rewriting the Lost Gospel, what we're calling Q, or the Logoi of Jesus. On the other hand, he's imitating Homeric epics. And often he embeds his imitations or the uses of the Q document inside of his imitations of Homer. And it's amazing how often that happens. So that he actually starts with sayings that appear in the Lost Gospel, and he contextualizes them in narratives that he gets from the Homeric epics or other poetry too. And the reason he's doing that is because he's competing with Virgil's Aeneid that also imitates Homer. So the genre of the Gospel of Mark, in my view, is not a biography of any kind. It's a myth of origins. It's trying to tell his readers after the Jewish war who their Lord is, what their in-group values are and how they began, who the bad people are, and what they can hope for in the future. And so that's the crafting of an art. It's an imitation of Homer to give encouragement to people who have suffered after the Jewish war.
So if I may interject here, Dennis, a couple of people actually fit the category you discuss in your book, the Q book that you're about to launch. And Nathan Meyer's question or statement really is in the category of the two extremes in a way. One extreme is we couldn't have lost any sayings of Jesus. The church would never allow that to happen. God would have preserved any potential earlier material than Mark. However, in the other direction that seems to be hyper skeptical is that Q is an assertion that gospel writers could not make anything up. But making things up was the chief activity of all early Christians, the only thing they liked better than burning. So that's the other hyper extreme, right? And if I may make a comment then allow you to elaborate, is this. Tell me if you think I'm on the money. First of all, if they had to make everything up and they're great at making things up, why is Luke borrowing from Matthew and Mark? Why is Matthew borrowing from Mark? Why are these gospel authors borrowing from each other? Couldn't they have just made up their whole gospel of its own? They're dependent on other sources in order to craft their narratives. So it seems the modus operandi of gospel authors are to borrow from other existing models and recraft their own narrative about Jesus. So it's very likely, combine that with the fact that you find material in Matthew and Luke that is not in Mark. This is what really brought people's attention is like, whoa, where did this material come from? Did Matthew make all of this up? Or is there good reason to also think that Matthew is dependent on earlier material and stuff? So the list goes on and on. I don't think it's absurd because even Goodacre, who I think really has pushed an online wave of skeptics that are anti-Q, even Goodacre in his engagement with you and other engagements pertaining to Q admits they are dependent on other sources to write these gospels. They're not like whole cloth fabricating everything out of their own brains. Like Mark did not take a pen with no other sources and just said, I'm just going to write everything out of my head. I'm going to make all of it up. No, they're dependent on something. And that's why they say, is it oral tradition? Is there an earlier source? Something is there. And even the most, far hypothesis types grant that there's something they're dependent on. They just don't like to say you can reconstruct that something.
That's right.
Ultimately. Okay. Sorry. I want to make sure that I'm on the same page. Did you want to comment on that at all, or?
I would say it a bit differently, I think, but I think you're moving in the right direction on that.
Okay.
I would make a distinction, though, between two different kinds of intertextual projects. One project is Scribal. That is, that these, take Matthew as an example. The way he treats Mark is the way a creative scribe would treat Mark. So sometimes it's called redaction. The Greek rhetoricians would call it metaphrasis. Metaphrasis is a rearrangement or a revisioning of a text that's saying the same thing. Mimesis is a different story. That is a literary imitation. And that's using an antecedent text as a model. And so you're writing, you're imitating something, but you're talking about something that is different. And let me give you an example. Luke is rewriting Mark's passion narrative. That's called metaphrasis in Greek rhetoric. But he's also imitating the death of Socrates in Plato's Phaedo. And that's mimesis. It's a use of a model for creating something different. Now, you talked about the gospel authors writing things without any antecedents. The problem is that they had many antecedents and they treat them with different methodologies. So on the one hand, you have scribalism, and that's what most commentaries emphasize when they look at the synoptics. How they use the word redaction, which I don't like as a word. I prefer metaphrasis as a way of talking about it, the way ancient rhetoricians would. But they also are doing mimesis. They're imitating models. And that is what my primary contributions have been to the field.
Right.
And to now, some of these models, people recognize they're imitating things in the Hebrew Bible. So that's not a problem. The problem is when you move into classical Greek poetry.
How dare you?
But they're not plagiarizing and they're not robbing.
They're not stealing.
They're not stealing. It's cultural engagement. It's the way that Jews and Christians identified themselves inside of the Greek society, where the Homeric epics were defining social identity. And so you imitate and change and show that your hero is more compassionate or more powerful or more holy or whatever. And so that it's a way of establishing for your in-group the ideal prototypical leader. And this has been established in social identity theory before. And I find it very useful to make sense of how these models work.
If I may, do you remember the smart fool?
Oh, yes, I do. Yes.
Very smart and clever. And they were questioning and, challenging, trying to, they've been reading you for years. They have a super chat.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
Hope you're doing well. Reading your book on Andrew, and it's great. You're not the only one. There's several scholars that I think really love his work on Andrew. And by the way, were persuaded of mimesis in your particular argumentation there. I'm writing an article that overlaps with your work and finding myself citing your work. Looking forward to reading your next book.
Oh, smart fool. I did not expect to have that kind of encouragement from you. And it shows that you're not a damn fool after all. You're just smart.
Yeah, very smart. Oh, that's awesome. That is awesome. Yeah, I think that, it's been a while since we've had Dennis here in person. Next trip I'll have to make down there to you.
Well, I want to make one more comment about to Smart Fool.
Please.
I didn't discover mimesis criticism by doing the Gospels. I did it from looking at Christian apocryphal writings, especially the Acts of Andrew. But one can find it also in the Acts of Paul to some extent, the Acts of Thomas. And these authors are Christian, and they're pious, and they're orthodox. They're not heretical. But they're using classical parallels, classical models, in order to craft their identity for their audiences. And it was it was almost 10 years after working on that material that I realized it's happening in the New Testament too. So I was late to the party, but the party was going on, and the party is a lot of fun. And I think that's one thing people don't realize about mimesis criticism. It requires one to engage in some of the most beautiful literature that, in my opinion, stand as classics in human experience. And if you haven't read the Iliad and the Odyssey, no matter what you think of my work, please enjoy Homer and the insight and the wisdom and the cleverness of the poet.
Thank you, the smart fool. I really appreciate it. I hope maybe you can reach out to me sometime. I'd be curious to pick your brain and maybe even have some chats with you, because the engagements we've had in the past in terms of helping to sharpen up what Dennis is saying and dealing with, what scholars say, those are always very fruitful. They help us progress the conversation and to get closer to what Dennis might say when a very smart academic comes in and says, I don't agree, and here's why, or here are my contentions, or here are my problems. Earlier, we recorded one of my friend Landon Sykes on Facebook, who's been a fan of MythVision for years, a very critical kind of question. And really what it sounds like is what makes the scholars, from what I can tell, be hesitant about your mimesis is Matthew. That Matthew's this big sore thumb in their eyes. Like they're willing to jump on Mark. They're definitely able to see Luke and Acts. And they're like, all right, we can do that. Matthew comes in and it is written. It is written. It is written. And what's he do with Mark's material is also what makes him go, well, I don't know if I can draw that conclusion, because I feel like they're getting overwhelmed with Matthew's interpretation of Mark. And that's my opinion, because I've seen it happen. Like the young boy at the tomb, right? You have your own mimetic connection. They immediately say it was an angel.
Yep.
Why? Because Matthew said it was an angel. So should we make Matthew's interpretation of Mark what Mark meant? Or should we go, okay, Mark is actually doing something and Matthew has a different agenda.
That's right.
And it's very Judaic, very within the Jewish tradition, and it is written kind of agenda. And so it's fantastic. I don't know who's ultimately right, what the truth is, Dennis, but if I'm not playing with all the toys, I can't tell you which ones are the most fun and stuff like that. That's why I love your scholarship.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, the smart fool. Really appreciate that. Someone said, someone left a comment, a stinging metal. Why doesn't Derek convert to Judaism, or is Judaism like all the other religions? Well, every religion I would say is different, are unique, and do different things. But yes, I would say it's just, I don't have any reason for me pragmatically to desire keeping kosher or Sabbath or any types of restrictions like that. But I also don't believe the God of Judaism, exists. I don't think Yahweh exists. So there's several reasons why I wouldn't convert to Judaism, or why I remain a secular humanist. But appreciate the comment asking. Let's see. Is there anything is there any questions that I missed? Nathan Meyer says, Uriel explains that Mark cribbed practically everything he has his Jesus say from Paul. What is remarkable is how little else he has to work from. Well, where did he get his narratives? I mean, he must have had scripture. Mark had to have had scripture. The way that he crafts Jesus looks very much like Elijah and Moses and scenarios, correct? But it's downplayed to emphasize a Greco-Roman kind of angle, whereas Matthew really heightens it. What would you say about that?
You're going to have to rephrase the question. I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
I don't know who this scholar is. Uriel explains that Mark cribbed practically everything he has his Jesus say from Paul.
Okay, but you brought in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah,
so I wasn't sure.
I could be mistaken because he's saying specifically everything Jesus has.
But it says it comes from Paul.
Right.
There are very few places where you can explain the narratives in the Gospel of Mark from Paul. But there is one that is really quite interesting, namely the Last Supper business. On the day of the night that Jesus was betrayed, he then had this meal with his disciples. And the language there is really very close to what one finds in the Gospel of Mark. And many people have said, and by the way, most recently, Robyn Faith Walsh has argued that Mark may have known the Pauline version. Paul is writing before Mark, that's for sure. And the parallels, I think, are really quite amazing. And there are places, there are about a dozen sayings that appear in Paul that get attributed to Jesus in the Gospels. So, and most of those come from Q material, in my view. So there are places where you have overlaps between Paul and Mark, but I don't know who this URL is, but it certainly is an overstatement in my view.
So they added, though, and I'm going to get to these super chats, is obviously he picked plot points from the Pentateuch and Homer.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. You did.
So you're on the same page. Cool. All right. The Smart Fool, again, is back. Says, did you get my blog post addressing the video response? Remember when we did our video response?
Yeah, right.
I went through the demonic example. I was looking, and I think it means to say looking forward to any criticisms, didn't hear back. I must admit, I haven't been, I just wrote this for those who are watching and aren't paying attention to the chat. I didn't go back to that site since then. In fact, I was actually, someone sent me the link of the criticisms because I don't stay on it. Which site was that? Do you remember exactly what that was?
No, I don't.
I'd have to look it up. Someone help me out in the chat here. Smartful, what site was that exactly that I was on? It's a well-known site that chat rooms or conversations and stuff are on it. Not Reddit, is it? Was it Reddit?
Yes, I think it is Reddit.
Okay, Reddit. Okay. I haven't been on there since we last spoke. I literally only went on there because someone was like, hey, check this out. They're engaging you, Dennis. I think like Robyn, Dennis, Litwa, you were getting thrown around, and there were people saying this person's better than that person. You know, there's different conversations going on, and we ended up engaging with this one because this one actually was, I would say, sophisticated. It was a good engagement, even though you were criticizing the claims that were being addressed there. We need to look at the blog post, though, and maybe we can do like a remote response.
Yep.
We can't do it now because we haven't read the blog post. But I'd be interested to see what you have to say about that, Dennis, and of course, see what he has to say. Then we got another one. Michael Beverly. Thank you so much for these super chats. I appreciate it. I just bought Odyssey translated Robert Fagel's Iliad by Emily Wilson. Did I do okay? I was sort of impulse shopping as I don't go to America much.
Those are two beautiful translations. And I've only been dabbling with Emily Wilson for about 2 months, and I've not gotten very far. Both of them have limitations, though. One is that neither one observes the line numbers in the Greek text. And so you have to consult the Greek text by looking up the equivalent lines, and I find it somewhat tricky. Fagel's is, in a way, the most literate of the translations, and he's also done the Iliad. And it's available also reasonably with audiobooks. And it's really quite wonderful to be taken in through a great poet, a modern poet. The advantage of Emily Wilson, some people say it's because she's a woman that it's important. Well, I don't know that that's the case. I don't want to stereotype men and women in this regard. But I can tell you that one of the beautiful things about her translation is that she's not interested so much in translating word for word but in line for line, even though she doesn't observe the lines herself. And she's interested in the emotional impact that the poetry delivers. And so some of her turns of phrase and the way she grips into the human experience in the translation is quite moving and beautiful. And I'm tempted in a book that I'm doing now after the Q book. It's called Synoptic Epistles.
This is going to be interesting.
Synoptic Epistles and Homeric Epics. And I'm tempted to use her translation in many passages just because of its emotional beauty. And she has an understanding of the Iliad, which is really quite profound. And I don't think I can use it much. But she says that usually the Iliad is thought of as a literature of male violence. And she says, I think it really is an epic about the fragility of life. Mm-hmm. And the emphasis for her often is on the Trojan women who are losing their boys and their husbands and their lovers and their fathers in the war and are fearful of being raped by Greek soldiers after the siege. And it is really emotionally powerful. And I hope you enjoy reading Emily Wilson as much as I do. But if you're interested in the poetry itself, I think Fagles is a great way to go. It's also wonderful to read Homer in Greek. And I know that's difficult for everybody. It still is difficult for me. But I've been doing it for 40 years, so I think I've got a way to handle it. But enjoy Emily Wilson. And go with the emotion and not just with the poetry.
Thank you so much. Imnag and the Hizzy, thank you so much for the super sticker, my friend. I did not see a comment, but I appreciate the love. Michael Bell says, responding to Q, don't deal in fantasies. We have the Gospels, and that's enough written fantasy.
Well, it is, but the problem, Michael, is that it doesn't answer all the critical questions about where this material is coming from. Why do we have doublets and non-doublets in these Gospels? Why? And the materials that are sayings that come out of a different cultural context. So we all have enough to do without worrying about reconstructing texts. I just happen to love these things and am interested in exploring the synoptic problem. And let me say one more thing, Michael. One of the things I find fascinating about the Q document is that it comes out of a social location that is much closer to the historical Jesus than any of the Gospels that are in the New Testament. It's concerned about Galilee. It does not consider Jesus the Jewish Messiah. It's not written by a Christian. It's written by a Jew prior to the Jewish War. His issues are Jewish. They have to do with Jewish Torah observance. And that's why the Pharisees are the bad boys in this story. And the Q document allows us to peel back from the Gospels the layers that appear after the Christianization of Jesus's image, after the Jewish war, after the preoccupation with what happened after the war in Judea, and get us closer to the historical Jesus. Now, I don't think there's anything in the Q document we can say Jesus actually said. There's a lot in the Q document that tells us who he was in Jewish society and what was going on. So I don't think the issue is written fantasy. I think the issue is how these texts are identifying themselves with certain social issues, political issues, and so on. And it helps us understand the origins of the Christian movement and the images of Jesus that informed it. Now, I'm an atheist. I'm not interested in theology. I think it's boring. I think the issue is human creativity and human struggle to make sense of the world. And that's what's going on in the Gospels. And I appreciate their efforts, even though I don't agree with them.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate the super chat. Let me see. We got couple more super chats. Then I saw a couple questions if we end up getting to them. New to the chat, Brave Kestrel. But love your channel. I am a recovering Christian, and I have the religious trauma that comes with the indoctrination and brainwashing. I honestly blame my BPD on it. Religion equals poison. What are your comments?
I think religion can be poison. I also think it can be a cure. And I think one needs to assess religion on the basis of what I call ethical pragmatism. What does religion do? Religion often helps to create schools and hospitals and eleemosynary institutions. And it can also create warfare and ban abortions when women need them. And I'm a graduate of Bob Jones University, a fundamentalist university. And I was damaged by religion. And I think that's one reason that I'm a humanist. But we're not going to get rid of religion any worse. And we're not going to get rid of religion any easier than we're going to get rid of music. I'm a musician myself. I play a 5-string banjo in Irish pub groups and bluegrass and all that. I love music. I do not like bad music. And music can do all kinds of wonderful things, and it can do some pretty miserable things. That's my attitude toward religion. We're going to live with religion, but we have to make sure that religion is smart and it doesn't harm people in it. And Brave Kestrel, I'm glad that you've broken away from bad religion. And I hope you find meaning in whatever is good for you. My attitude toward life, and Derek knows this very well, we've talked about it often. My understanding of ethics is the creation of something beautiful. And I don't mean that as just music. I mean it as a beautiful environment. I mean it as beautiful human relations. I mean it as peace. And I know that that's as woke as it can be. And I want to have a t-shirt that says, I'd rather be woke than asleep.
Right.
And I think there are so many people who make fun of wokeness. I'm proud to be woke. I think that's what we need. And Brave Kestrel, maybe you can join me in being woke in this way. But I'm sorry that religion was so poisonous for you.
Thank you for that super chat, my friend. Lana Spencer, thank you so much for the super sticker. I was looking for a comment in case you did have one or a question or something, but I really do appreciate it. I didn't see one. I did not see one. Thank you so much for the support. Really appreciate it. Imnag, I've seen a few documentaries stating that the Flavians wrote the 4 books of the New Testament. Is that a real possibility?
No.
You're going to have to comment on that one.
I've heard that advanced. I don't know what they have possibly as the arguments for it. So I really don't know what I can say if I'm not familiar with the arguments.
Well, I know that it's mainly a lot of it's like pro-Roman materials. And of course, you have some people like have you ever read Joseph Atwell's Caesar's Messiah?
No.
I'd have to send it to you, but it's a connection to what he's trying to do is connect Josephus into the gospel narrative, the passion narrative with Jesus, and saying that Titus's military campaign overlaps with Jesus. Now, his interpretation technically is that the gospels and he thinks they're all written like in one room or in the same area with different authors that are writing. Like he has his own unique interpretation of the Gospels, but he thinks that they're like spoofs to trick Jews into worshiping Titus because they won't worship anyone other than their God. So it's like a joke on them. And at one point I thought, whoa, at first when I came across this, because I was like experimenting and checking out all these stuff, like, dude, this is it. There are some interesting elements that you find in Josephus that I was pretty interested to see, but he like parallels them and acts like Jesus is technically Titus incognito. And it's all about getting you to secretly worship Titus.
Oh dear.
Vespasian. Yeah.
Oh dear.
Yeah. But that'd be one example. There are various forms of what they call Roman provenance, but ultimately it's this angle that is suggesting that the Gospels are pro-Roman. And because they're pro-Roman, and they survive, and what we have that seem to be...
I'll tell you, Mark is not pro-Roman. Okay? So we'll just start there. And it's the earliest of the Gospels, and the other Gospels are indebted to it. Mark is clearly anti-Roman. He's writing after the Jewish war. He knows the story of the healing of the centurion's son, and he changes it so that the son becomes Jewish. The demons in the garrison demoniac are called Legion, and he's drowned in the sea, and it comes from Jerash. Jerash was used as a military compound. And on the shields of the 10th Legion of the Romans, there was a boar. I can't imagine that Mark would have any truck with anything in Rome. So sorry about that.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I think we caught up on those. And now I'm going to go up to a couple of these chats until we get another super chat that were interesting comments I think I saw. Bear with me. Oh, Lana Spencer said, I've listened to Dr. MacDonald's course twice already. I'm going to listen a few more times. Highly recommend it to everyone. I also have his books. Thank you all so much. So that was the comment. I missed Lana Spencer's comment.
Thank you, Lana. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thank you. This was an interesting one I saw. Liberty Jackson. MythVision podcast. What does Dr. MacDonald think about the anti-Semitism in Matthew and John and the church fathers?
Well, those let's do Matthew and John. And if you want to, Liberty, if you want to pursue church fathers, we can do that. The anti-Semitism in Matthew first. Matthew is written after the Jewish war and is rewriting the Gospel of Mark, which he thinks is a bit too much in the direction of Hellenism. And the community of that Matthew is writing to, and I don't mean as a community, I mean his readers, are involved in a reinterpretation of Judaism after the Jewish war, which has to do with now that the temple is destroyed, and a recreation of Judaism where its primary locus of authority is going to be in synagogues, and its primary authority is not going to be priesthood, but it's going to be the texts, namely the Pentateuch. And so Matthew is placing Jesus in the context of a contested understanding of the heritage of Moses and the law and the prophets. So I like to think of Matthew's anti-Semitism to be something like this. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of scribes and Pharisees, you'll not enter the kingdom of God. So that it's competitive Judaism. It's not anti-Semitism at all. It's competitive Judaism, that we are the better heirs of the Jewish tradition. So I would get rid of anti-Semitism and talk about it as Jewish rivalry. Okay? The Gospel of John is a different story. It's really written probably in 3 different stages. And the first stage is interested in depicting Jesus as a new Dionysus, where Jesus, like Dionysus, can offer wine to people and promise eternal life if they imbibe his flesh and drink his blood. But that text then gets rewritten in what I call the anti-Jewish gospel. And this is a place where it is likely written after Johannine Christians have been expelled from the synagogue. Probably happens around 120, 125. And actually, we know of that also in Jewish texts. And the Johannine community has been so burned by the exclusion that they are trying to, and this is where you get the really hostile anti-Judaism. And this is anti-Semitism in the Gospel of John. You are of your father, the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning, and so on, that kind of rhetoric. It has no place in humanist discourse, in my view. I think it's just reprehensible. Mm-hmm. So whereas Matthew's involved in Jewish competitiveness, John is complaining about the middle section of John. The second edition of John is written to make Jesus anti-Jewish in this case. And he's the proper architect of the Jewish tradition. So that anyway, I guess I would say that.
So technically, Matthew can be interpreted and seems to have been interpreted by early church fathers and such in a manner that was utilized to kind of couple with John, right? Like this, it could be used in an anti-Semitic way, even though you're suggesting the author or the original authorial intent is this is showing competitive Jewish sects and one is demonizing the other, in-group, out-group kind of stuff.
I'll give you an example. Jesus says in Matthew, but not in Q or in Mark, and it's different also from Luke and John. He says the rabbis basically sit on the throne of Moses. Do what they say, just don't do what they do. And so he argues that those who obey Torah are going to have a higher righteousness than those who are actually in competitive synagogues. And the author also uses an unusual and important expression, their synagogue. So it's a distinction between the synagogue, the synagogues or worship of the communities that Matthew's addressing. But you also have their synagogue or synagogues.
Specific buildings. Okay. Next super chat, Michael Beverly. Why? What is Mark doing with the post-baptism visit to the desert where Satan shows up?
Actually, Mark gets that from the Q document, and the Q document has done so in order to fit a kind of mythic pattern that you also find, by the way, in the Odyssey. Young Telemachus, Odysseus's son, has a visitation by Athena, who flies to him, by the way, reassures him that he's the son of Odysseus, and says, you've got to go and kick butt in your house to get rid of the suitors. And so when he goes to the suitors, he's trying to claim back his kingdom. And he's going to have to resist them. And in the end, with his father, he's going to kill the suitors and take responsibility of the kingdom. In the Q document, the same thing happens. The Holy Spirit or the Spirit of God flies to Jesus like a dove. A heavenly voice says, you are my beloved son. Then the devil offers him the kingdoms of the world, and Jesus refuses it because he knows now that he's God's son, he's responsible for God's kingdom. So as soon as he goes to Galilee, what does he say? He says, repent, the kingdom of God is upon you. It has arrived. And so Jesus is crowned as the prince in a sense, but he has to show his mettle that he's worth it. By the way, this is a part of the hero cycle that's been recognized, that young men often, like Gilgamesh, have to face a dragon or a challenge early in their careers to show them their mettle and that they're worthy of being a hero. And then they go and they have their exploits and careers. So and by the way, the Buddha has a similar experience before he goes out and cares for the poor and then preaches enlightenment.
Thank you. We've got another one up here. Merlin Shocked. Thank you so much for the super chat. Appreciate it. And they asked, wondering what Dennis thinks about astrotheology and its possible influence on the Gospels.
By astrotheology, I'm assuming that you mean certain kinds of astrological calculations and so on. I don't think there's any real influence on the Gospels, to be honest with you. And I'm sure that you wanted a longer answer. I don't know that I have one for you.
Yeah, and I think that just to give a little more context is usually it's not just calculations, but they'll see characters, like usually that play a role. Like there's a scene in, I think it's in Mark, where it says that the man carrying the water pitcher to that house follow him. Isn't that in Mark?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I've had a scholar, or I think he's a scholar, he's a Bible thinker for a long time, Bill Darlison, who thought that this might actually be Aquarius in some symbolic way of a man carrying a pitcher of water, because women usually did so at this time. And so why is this man carrying a pitcher of water into this house? Maybe this is some type of astrotheological in the myth of the gospel story, hinting at the heavens.
But you have a wonderful Homeric explanation for that fellow. It's a water-carrying woman that leads Odysseus's search party into the castle of the Lastrygonians, who are cannibals, and they eat lots of Odysseus's men. So they follow this water carrier into an upper room. Now, the reason that you have a man in the Gospel of Mark is if you tell your search party, go and find a woman that's carrying water, they're going to find hundreds of women that are carrying water. You have to have a man carrying water to be distinctive, so you know who to follow to the upper room. That'd be my explanation.
Thank you so much, Merlin. I appreciate the love and support. Ralph GT, thank you for the super chat. Looking to make sure I didn't miss any comment. Oh, there you are. The God and Anatomy book by Dr. Stavrakopoulos gave me a great idea for a novel. Ooh, that book is, you haven't read it probably, but no. It's fantastic. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, is that right?
Oh yeah, big time. Thank you, Ralph. Appreciate that. I look forward to seeing what you come up with. Is it Magelio? Mahelio Montagna. Good topic, because I always wondered why Christians reject being Jewish when their God, Jesus, is Jewish. I think it's, tell me if you think this is where I think this is coming from. Paul is working overtime to get non-Jews into the movement. In doing so, he's saying you don't need to become a Jew, because a Jew is one inward and not outward. So you technically are a Jew, but you don't need to circumcise and follow these laws and blah, 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 blah. Just join us, because tomorrow the end comes anyway, et cetera, et cetera. And they join. And that starts what I would call a snowball effect that over time gets bigger and more not so Jewish, I guess you'd say. What would you say?
Well, it's a fascinating question. Paul understood his so-called conversion not as a conversion of religion, but an opening up of the promises of biblical Israel to Gentiles. And so the Gentiles that are invited to the Pauline circles are then understood to be welcome to the fortunes of Israel. But Paul is still Jewish. He expects his group to be the rightful heirs of Judaism. Later, again, this Christian identity theory becomes important. Later, the Christian communities are interested in distancing themselves from Judaism and demonizing Judaism, as we saw in the Gospel of John. I think the issue has to do with the growing identity and distance of the Christian movement from Judaism.
Thank you so much for that super chat. The smart fool is back. I'm open to Dionysus' influence in wine, but Meyer, I think that's a scholar, shows convincingly the second edition evangelist adding that scene and themes not in first layer.
A smart fool, that's a very smart question. And the question then becomes, what criteria does one use to determine what's in the first edition or in the second edition? And I think the evidence is really quite overwhelming that the Dionysian influence is right at the beginning. And again, I'd have to show you the evidence for it, but I'll give you one little piece of it that's, I think, quite fascinating. In the Dionysian gospel, or there are two layers of tradition in the fourth gospel, and they have to do with who is responsible, who's the enemy of Jesus in these narratives. In the early versions, in the first version, the enemies are always the Jewish leaders, chief priests, and scribes and Pharisees and so on. In the second edition, where you have anti-Judaism, it's the Jews who are a problem. The entire religion of Judaism, or Judeans, is the problem. Now, it's very difficult for me to imagine it moving in the other direction, that it's the Jews who are the problem already. And then you have, in the Dionysian level, it kind of settles down, and it's only their leaders. It's not Jews. I just don't think that makes sense in terms of the development of the community. But there are other reasons too. And so I would say that the Dionysian influence is earlier. I have a long discussion, by the way, of the stratigraphy of the Gospel of John in its compositions. And I lay out the criteria there. And by the way, I'm not so original on that. Other people hold the same criteria in the same stratigraphy.
The same layer one.
Right.
Now, does anyone else agree with your Dionysian layer?
Yes, they do, as a matter of fact. And there's going to be apparently a commentary written on the Gospel of John that
The Hermeneia?
I don't know who's going to give it. It's actually written by a South African.
Okay. Well, I just to find common ground here on Dionysus' influence in wine. Now that I know what I know, I don't know any other way to understand that without like butchering that common element that Dionysus is turning water into wine or even milk into wine, depending on the source. So there's several sources, of course, that describe the miracle of him transforming fluids into wine.
Yep.
And I just don't get why scholars, what do you think the hesitation is on that one?
Well, I just think they're nervous about having a gospel author imitating Dionysus. By the way, let me just say one other thing that I think has not been understood well. The Gospel of John knows at every level of the composition of the Gospel of John, they know the synoptic gospels. I think the evidence is overwhelming. But the gospels of the synoptic gospels are really hard on the reader. Take up your cross and follow me.
Mm-hmm.
Hate your father and mother. There are treasures laid up for you in heaven if you're hated by the authorities and so on.
Sell all that you have. All that.
But Dionysus is the donor deity. He gives you wine. He gives you love. He gives you a happy time now in this life. And I think the Gospel of John is competing with Dionysian religion. And that's why in the opening chapter of the Gospel of John, the author goes out of his way to say that Jesus gives life. He gives gift after gift. And he tented among us, and he gives us these gifts. You don't find anything like that in the Synoptic Gospels. The Gospel of John is interested in competing with Dionysus to say that Jesus can give you a good time too.
And Hang Fashi, forgive me, I have to get this because I love it when these happen. Just fascinating. You guys hate Christianity with a passion.
Grant, you don't get me. I live in a community of retired missionaries. I'm not against religion. I'm against stupidity. I'm against people being ignorant of their origins. I love these texts as much as anyone I know. And I admire the creativity of what they're trying to accomplish, especially when you compare them to the Greek mythologies. I am not against the Christian religion. I'm against harmful Christian religion, you bet.
Yeah. I can I comment on this? I just made a point.
Yeah, of course.
So, oh, nice. You called me ignorant. Well, if someone doesn't know you and you make a false statement that is ignorant, is it wrong to say what you just said was ignorant?
First of all,
no.
I didn't say you were ignorant.
No, but by the fact that the claim he's saying you just hate Christianity and you're correcting that and saying, no, I don't. I just don't believe it anymore. And I love the literature and stuff. In a sense, they're interpreting that as you calling them ignorant. Like they don't.
Well, I understand that. And I would say, Grant, that you misunderstood what I intended.
Yeah. Anyway, just helps get the chat, riled up and stuff. All right, we got another one. Hang for she in the house. Thank you for the support. Recently, I read an essay. Was it Parable of the Good Samaritan? The author suggested that the Greek adverb for near was shifted to a noun in English, neighbor. Is there anything to this? That would be a radically different, reading. So it's like those who are near you rather than just being your neighbor. Have you heard that or read that anywhere?
Well, Placion does mean somebody. I believe that's the Greek word, Placion. No, I guess I don't know quite how to look at it. If I had a Greek text in front of me, it would help.
Yeah. But
I'm not sure I know I don't know how that matters. The parable of the Good Samaritan. There might be something to it.
Well, the lesson, of course, is to be good to your neighbors. And obviously in this case, it's the Jews themselves or other people of his own kind were not helping him, and then a stranger.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. I'm not familiar with that.
All right. Thank you, Hangfa. I'm sorry we couldn't give you more on that specifically. I really do appreciate the support, though. Grandmaster Stash, thank you for the super chat. Did Grandmaster have a question? I don't see a question. I do not see a question. I don't see a question. Okay. Thank you so much for the support. I just like to make sure I don't leave anybody hanging. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Okay. Dennis, this book's out right now. This book is your really almost everything you've written in some way, form, or fashion, even though it's not as extensive. You've written several of the books. I pulled the Dionysian Gospel off. You've got all sorts of stuff. And you have 2 books that are in the works right now. One is any day, probably within the next 2 to 3 days, going to be launched, correct?
Oh, it's probably going to be longer than that because we have to finish the cover. I'm waiting for one more of the endorsements that's been promised. So I'm not sure. It'll almost certainly be out by March 1st. So give me a month and we'll have it out.
Okay. And then one more super chat here. Merlin Shocked says, any thoughts on which, if any, Christian denomination is the best, which would be your subjective opinion? Any thoughts on Orthodox versus Catholic? Orthodox seems more symbolically oriented.
So the first question I'm going to answer is related probably to Protestantism. Then I can talk about Orthodoxy and Catholicism. The one question I would have is, do you consider Unitarians and Universalists a Christian denomination? And that denomination itself is divided by those who identify themselves with the Christian Protestant tradition, those who understand themselves to be humanist. But I think the advantage of that discourse is that it incorporates things as a Unitarian of different religions and seeks wisdom from them all. My issue with them is they still are theistic, and I'm an atheist. And so I would think that that is really a wonderful way of being theological and having a sense of God, which is universal and attempts to gain wisdom from various groups. Those who are most clearly identified with the Christian tradition, I would think would include the United Church of Christ that I belonged to for quite a while. Certain kinds of Mennonite groups are wonderful. Again, I would use ethical pragmatism to determine which groups are best for the human race and for the environment. I have my problems with all forms of orthodoxy. And despite the beautiful intellectual and liturgical traditions of orthodoxy. And the problem is that, unfortunately, orthodoxy has become too orthodox. By that, I mean that it does not allow for diversity. And it is unquestioning of its scholarship. So I've had many Orthodox students, and I've been at their ordinations, and I've found them to be almost always unteachable because they are so protective of doctrine and the history of the tradition that they can't absorb the questioning that goes along with this. I have friends in Egypt now who have to worry about being imprisoned because they have questions about the historicity of the Gospels. And this is really a tragedy. By the way, think of it this way. The Russian Orthodox Church blessed Putin and the war on Ukraine as a holy war. You tell me if that church has any prophetic voice to its own people about genocide. And by the way, I have Orthodox friends who agree with me that that is a major blemish on Orthodoxy, its inability to speak to power with prophecy. On the other hand, it gives encouragement to lots of people who are looking forward to the afterlife and so on. Catholicism is such a complex phenomenon right now. And I have very good friends who are faithful Catholics who are so upset about what's going on with the Catholic hierarchy, the obsession with abortion issues, with their attitudes toward the sexual abuse of priests and so on. And they say, this is our community, but we're embarrassed by our community. And we're doing the best we can. But on the other hand, Catholics have been very good on social welfare. They're on integration issues. So there's so much to be said about the intellectual tradition and liturgical traditions, ethical traditions of Catholicism. Unfortunately, it's not living up to its best values.
Thank you.
Nor am I guess.
The Gypsy Prince. Thank you, the Gypsy Prince, for the support. I appreciate the love. Let me scroll here. Is it Adriane, gentlemen? Thank you for the super chat. No question here. Just love and learning from MythVision. Only found your channel a few months ago. Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm glad it is helpful. Our friend here again says, Derek, we appreciate your in-depth lectures on comparative mythology. I think that's you and me in that one that we did together, I imagine, particularly regarding Greek mythology. It's monumental. So I suspect that's the course that you and I did.
Okay, yeah, good.
I suspect.
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but thank you so much for that. And just want to make sure I hit everything before I exit here, because we have to go in just a second. Sign up for the course, speaking of which, that me and him did. 18 lectures, goes into the mimesis criticism.
I want to say one thing while you're looking about this book called Synoptic Epistles and Homeric Epics. And it should be out around July 1st. And it consists of 32 apocryphal epistles that I wrote, giving voice to the various gospel authors, including the author of Q. And they argue with each other. So the subtitle has to do with how the gospel authors clashed with each other. And so how Matthew is not happy with things that Mark says. The Q author is not happy with things that Mark says. Luke gives his comments about all of his predecessors and so on. And so these are letter exchanges between the apostles or the evangelists saying what they like and don't like about each other's work. And it was so much fun to write. So my other books have been on what the gospel authors did with Homer or Q or whatever, and with each other. This is a book about how and why they did so. And so I'm getting into the motivations of the various authors. And it was so much fun to write. And there's nothing like it out there. And it's going to be a lot of fun to read. Really.
I know a few people have read it, like me, Richard Miller. We've got, read into it at least some. I guess the best way I'd paint it is, the models that scholarship has on what Matthew's doing to Mark's text, where we see he's clearly lifting from Mark and changing things, or Luke to Matthew or Luke to Mark or whatever. And I'm using the most well-established because I know Q comes into this, but just for our audience sake now, what Dennis is doing is creating hypothetical conversations that are based off good interpretive models using methodologies that he has on why Matthew is arguing with Mark. What the hell were you thinking, Mark? I can't believe you put this is the right way to do it. And then Mark's going, why did you change my, and like he's gonna have
That's what it is.
It's gonna be exciting. I think it'll be really good. All right. William Arens, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Always been here. You've been here for a long time, and I really appreciate it. As someone who is still Christian, I don't find either of you a threat. I believe each branch of Christianity needs to see themselves on their own odysseys, each with separate heroes and journeys.
I actually have fans who are in the ministry, especially Protestant ministry, and they say that it gives them new insights into the New Testament that they hadn't had before. And they appreciate that it solves some questions for them. And again, I'm not anti-Christian, so I'm great. I live in a retirement community where there are a lot of retired missionaries, and they're really interested in this kind of thing. This discourse matters to them. So, William, I'm so glad that you find some insight from this. And yes, we're all on our own odysseys. And yeah.
My chip might be a little bigger on my shoulder than Dennis's, but I'm definitely not trying to be harmful in any way to people, or whatever. I definitely like to challenge. I like to challenge the thinking and why I don't draw those conclusions. But William, you're always welcome here, and I do appreciate you being here. Thank you. The Gypsy Prince, were Jesus' followers really fishermen? Or was that a mythical title for the apostles of the Christian cult because they were fishers for men?
Gypsy Prince, that's a fun question, and I've got a fun answer for you. No, they weren't fishermen, and it's not a mythical title of the apostles. It rather is an imitation of Odyssey Book 2, when Athena, disguised as Telemachus, gets him a ship and a crew in order to sail off to find out about his father as a part of creating his, recovering his kingdom and his estate back home. And the Gospel of Mark is the first person ever to have called the body of water in Galilee the Sea of Galilee. And he needs a boat and a crew in order to sail from side to side of that large lake, but it certainly isn't a sea. And we know that the Q document has its own way of talking about Jesus acquiring followers, but they're not fishermen. And the Gospel of Luke knows that this is coming from Odyssey 2 because he embellishes it with another poem called the Homeric Hymn to Dionysus. So it's based on Homeric myth and a Homeric hymn. But it also is a revision of the Q document and Jesus acquiring followers. But Mark is going to need a ship and the Sea of Galilee and a crew. And so that's why they become fishers for humans.
Thank you so much. The name, hold on. Aunt Jura was saying, MythVision podcast, Gypsy is a slur, please stop saying it. The Gypsy Prince is the name of the super chatter. So I didn't know what word they were talking about. And I don't know. Do you have any clue about the history of that?
I'm not going to comment on why someone who's admiring this discussion wants to identify as a gypsy. Yes, from outsiders, a gypsy, by the way, it just means Egyptian. That's where the word comes from. So a gypsy prince could say that they're identifying themselves with the people who are on the outside or creative people. I don't have any antipathy for gypsies. And in fact, they're better called Roma. But I understand the allergy to the name gypsy when it's used as a slur. So I can understand that.
I definitely was reading this just normal. Like I didn't see anything, I don't know. Anyway, thank you so much. Appreciate everybody being positive and having a good time here, hanging out with me and Dennis. Stay tuned. 2 books are on their way. And I plan on making some trips down to Cali to come see him and Dr. Richard C. Miller at some point. We have to do some more recordings. And I want both of you guys the same. We got to get you together and go at this stuff. So, and let you guys, give each other pats on the back. What do you like about each other's stuff? And then also critique, what you think you could do maybe different or whatever. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. So anyway, I love you, everybody. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful day, and let's do this again. Any final words?
Create something beautiful. find out where your life is going and how you can use that life in creating something beautiful for the environment, for the human community, for health. Be good to yourselves that way.
Thank you.